Hey, welcome back to another episode of Firewall. As usual, I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. With me today is a guest whose website I think most people listening to this podcast are really going to like. Probably embraces some of what we try to do here on Firewall, but much, much better than we do it. So Freddie Sayers, the executive editor of UnHerd, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So fundamentally, you're taking this world of digital media that's extremely saturated. You got Google and Facebook killing everyone to the point where they're now being investigated, even by the Trump administration for antitrust violations. And in the middle of all that, you start a digital media property. So one, what were you thinking? And two, how do you make this thing work?
Well, I actually joined. I shouldn't claim to have been the sole founder. I joined a year and a half ago.
Okay.
We were already there for about a year. And UnHerd's mission, put simply, is it's UnHerd. So there's a kind of slightly heavy-handed pun going on there, where we have the two aspects. We want to push back against herd mentality, which, as we all know, is something that is kind of more relevant than ever. And we want to try and platform otherwise unheard ideas and people and places. And it was kind of trundling along quite nicely. And then suddenly, around just over a year ago, it began to really take off. And now I think we're 7 times larger in terms of audience than we were 12 months ago. So yes, I think the atmosphere that has happened in the past year, we had a general election in the UK, almost exactly a year ago, actually. I think it was the 12th of December, which seemed to change politics and seemed to create new alignments and seemed to bust the old herds, the old groups, which definitely was good for us. And of course, the lockdowns and COVID and everything has also exacerbated a lot of that intensity. And there's a lot of things that people feel they can and can't say. And I think the presence of a platform that is unafraid to challenge those alignments and say things even if they might be taboo has just become even more important.
So when one of your writers says something that then offends people on the left or the right, and they start getting roasted on Twitter and every other platform, you guys like, hey, we're standing by you, we're going to double down. How do you give writers the confidence to say things that are taboo when everyone else is always diving for cover?
Yeah, it is hard. And actually, I'm fresh from a bit of a mauling myself. So I'm coming to this podcast limping and bruised. I put something out on Twitter without having fully researched it, in truth, which is always a kind of cardinal mistake. Someone called Julie Birchall, who's a journalist here, or writer here in the UK, had made offensive remarks to another journalist which referenced Islam. I hadn't actually seen it, but now her publisher has cancelled all of her books. Her forthcoming book will now no longer be published. And all of these journalists were kind of jumping on it on Twitter, sort of celebrating the fact that she has now been silenced. And I just put out a tweet saying that I didn't think that was a good principle, and that better to let people make their arguments and be proven wrong than cancel them entirely.
Right.
And predictably, does that mean I was agreeing with her offensive remark? Am I now kind of Islamophobe and all the rest of it? So I kind of wish I hadn't entered that fray this afternoon. But I think it is important that some people do, because otherwise we'll all take the easier path. And there's sort of a ratchet effect that the sort of space of what's allowed to be said shrinks. And once it shrinks, it only ever seems to get smaller. So I think it's very important that there are people who are reasonable, who are not considered kind of out there reactionaries or crazies or angry, who are calmly but firmly making the case that actually, no, people must be allowed to say what they think, and a kind of culture where we're all running scared is not a healthy culture, and it's not the kind of culture we want to live in.
So Twitter is both unbelievably powerful and in some ways kind of powerless. And oftentimes it seems to me that the solution is just don't use Twitter, right? Like I suspect that I get beat up all a week ago. It came out that we're going to run Andrew Yang's campaign for mayor of New York, and I think know, whatever they didn't like about me, they hit Yang with on Twitter. Whatever they didn't like about Yang, they hit me with on Twitter.
Right.
And I know it must have been bad because I had employees who seemed to be worried about it. But like, I just don't go on it. So it had no psychological impact on me at all. Why isn't the answer to just say, like, forget it? Like, I'm just going to ignore Twitter completely, and all of your approbation, therefore, basically is a tree falling in the forest with no one there to hear.
Well, I think it's a little bit like some of these things began life among students and have now become much more mainstream. And similarly, you know, a Twitter effect has now spilled out into the real world. I mean, the example I was having this ding dong on Twitter about earlier today was to do with the book being cancelled. So ultimately, a publisher, a commercial entity, looked at something that happened on Twitter and decided, actually, we can't represent this author anymore. It's going to be too difficult to defend. And therefore, let's not bother. So, you know, what starts within the kind of Twitter sphere does have tentacles that reach quite far and wide. And that's why I do think it's worth paying attention to.
Does this author, does she sell a lot of books normally, or is it sort of a commercially easy decision for the publisher to make?
Well, she's called Julie Birchall. I mean, she's not my, look, I'm not going to stand here and say she's my favorite.
She's your best friend, right?
And I don't want to defend everything she said by any means, but, you know, she's like a lively, somewhat controversial, very well-known British author who used to be a columnist at the Times and has written many, many books and is a sort of known character on the literary journalistic scene. And now, you know, suddenly will be silenced. And I just think if you say something, even if it's really stupid and if it's offensive and if it's bad, apologize, show that you've understood that it was wrong. And I think it's okay to take people to task for what they say. I think it's very important. But the idea that your whole output then must be beyond the pale, even if one remark is stupid and insensitive or even outright offensive, that's the step I can't go along with.
And the publisher is presumably a for-profit business and not a nonprofit, right? So why wouldn't they say, okay, here is someone who is well known, they're even better known now because of this controversy. This is a great time to publish their book. Why wouldn't they embrace that as opposed to running from it?
Well, as we've seen things recently in the New York Times and other media outlets where high-profile people have left. Within each of these organizations, and, you know, publishing house, there's been a lot of convergence. They're all part of big corporations now. They are now subject to a kind of understandable corporate sensitivity that they don't want to be on the wrong side of the morally righteous brigade, basically, which you can kind of understand, but which does have quite serious effects. So I do think it's important to provide places where people can not, I definitely don't think we should be celebrating people being offensive and, you know, but we used to live in a world where people could be much more robust. And yeah, they might even say offensive things, but people kind of argued back, they rolled along with it. And it seems like we're in this sort of ever shrinking world where 1 foot wrong means that you're no longer an acceptable person.
Well, yeah, and can anyone really ultimately survive kind of the purity death march? You know, at the end of the day, no matter how fervent you are in your beliefs and how much you try to live them, you're human, which means you're going to fuck something up, or in some way do something that someone doesn't like. Doesn't everyone eventually just become discredited simply because, like, that's just the way life works?
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that Twitter is so new. I mean, if we'd had records like Twitter of everything people had said in previous generations, my God, we could mine those for some amazingly offensive things, I'm sure. The fact that we sort of put out these thoughts quite quickly and sometimes without much thought, sort of thinking in advance, means that there's suddenly this kind of official black and white record of what people have said. And that's new. And I think, in a way, because that's there, we need to be more tolerant, not less tolerant, of people who make missteps. There's something quite sinister, I think, about the combination of an atmosphere of sort of moral high ground and a lot of the sort of censorious atmosphere that goes on social media is about people saying, that was morally unacceptable. That person should not be allowed because what they said was morally unacceptable. But alongside that, what they're doing themselves is not very kind. It's not forgiving. It's not human, really, to hold people to these standards that we all know are not realistic. Isn't a very moral thing to do, I don't think. So there's a sort of hypocrisy there, which we need to plug away at. And I think we're actually making some ground. There was another example in the UK. I know you've had a lot of high-profile people kind of leaving and setting up their own Substacks and so on in the US.
Yeah.
We also had someone called Suzanne Moore at The Guardian who left The Guardian, and we featured her story on UnHerd. And we've obviously had J.K. Rowling, who has managed to withstand, because she's so famous and so loved and so wealthy and cares so little about that kind of opprobrium. She's managed to withstand what would otherwise have totally defeated a public figure. So do you feel there's some cause for optimism that there's a bit of a pushback going on, and the sort of lines are being very slightly redrawn?
I mean, it's a logical conclusion to sort of people, the moral approbation leading people to kind of retreat further and further into very kind of narrow realms. Is that necessarily, like, if that's where we land and everyone's just kind of, talking to their own people and doing their own thing? I mean, I understand the argument as to why it makes it hard for society to make big decisions and how it's hard for us all to be united. But is that not just like human nature to be tribal, kind of reasserting its control over kind of technology?
I think that's probably right. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of, I think the COVID example is also relevant here. I think, we talk about the natural kind of tribal, natural groups that disagree with each other versus a kind of official, universal, scientific truth, which in a way is what a lot of these tech platforms aspire to or talk about. I think the COVID era has really challenged that because, for example, people who weren't happy about some of the restrictions, the tech platforms were really not sure what to do about that. Was it quote unquote unsafe? We had the CEO of YouTube saying that she was going to take down any video content that fell foul of World Health Organization, WHO guidelines, because that would have been anti-science. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has had a pretty controversial time of it, and a lot of things they have said earlier in this season have proven to be not quite right. So, choosing what that sort of universal truth is going to be starts getting very difficult. And actually, I think it's a more realistic and healthier end goal to say, let's have a safe but pretty robust public square where people can make their arguments and fight it out, essentially, and hopefully the best arguments will win. But when you start going down the road of the platforms choosing which arguments are right and which ones are wrong, you're taking steps on quite a dangerous journey, I think.
And, I don't know if you've been following this issue or not, but in the US, there's a rare public policy issue that seems to have united both parties in Washington, which is there's a statute called Section 230 that protects platforms like Facebook from liability based on the comments of their users. And because I think both parties are convinced that Facebook is out to get them, they want to remove that liability protection. How do you think things change if all of a sudden the platforms are responsible for what the people who use them say?
Well, I mean, that would be the end of it, I think, for a lot of these big platforms. And what would happen is that the conversation would move elsewhere. I mean, as we know, they're not technologically especially difficult to reproduce. We've already had Parler popping up as a sort of alternative to Twitter. I think people would open forums that were more open quite quickly. So I think although I'm all for sticking it to the big tech platforms, and I think as a journalist, I think they've had an incredibly good run of it for the past few years, and I think it's right that they're held to account. The idea that every single comment that's ever posted on Facebook needs to be directly liable for, would, I think, be an end to them.
Yeah, and is that ultimately bad or good?
I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, but actually, I would rather there were open media platforms where everyone can express themselves, and whether that's Facebook or Twitter or a different platform, I don't really care. But would rather have that than too much political interference in any direction. Frankly, whether that's white nationalists using Facebook algorithms in an extremely clever way to propagandize, or whether that's Democrats leaning on Facebook to pull down content that doesn't agree with their public health policy. In either direction, I think it's dangerous, and we should aim for a free and open conversation.
So Facebook, we know how they make money, right? Their goal is to get you on the platform for as much as possible, for as long as possible. And then from there, mainly target ads at you, or now even just sell you things directly, especially on Instagram. So when I signed up for UnHerd, it didn't charge me anything to sign up. I haven't seen any ads. The site looks really good. Your writers seem really impressive. What's the business model?
We are actually, it's quite timely because we are launching our first paid subscription before Christmas as a pre-Christmas offer. So we are, I think, first of all, we're lucky that we are well-funded, principally from one donor. And a lot of, realistically, a lot of media, both old and new, has gone in that direction recently. But we are going to move aggressively to a model where it's sustainable from user contributions. Like all media platforms, we've got to try and balance that. We don't want to kiss goodbye to our audience, which we cherish, and suddenly bring down a wall. But we need to move to that. So we're going to start with almost like a luxury subscription. So you can carry on reading it, most of the content for free. If you want, you can still get the daily email and so on. But if you're joined as a member, you then get the app, you get special video content, you get extras, essentially members meetings and events and the like. So we'll see how that goes. And then during the course of next year, we'll start reducing the number of articles you can read for free. And hopefully we won't frighten everyone off, and a good number of people will convert.
And then what about U.S. expansion? I know that you're expanding into the U.S. Is it purely, hey, there's a lot more eyeballs here, or is there something specific that you think UnHerd can do that isn't being taken care of right now in the marketplace?
I mean, it's the latter. I really feel that the US media, more than anywhere else, needs some disruption and needs some new players in it. These extremely bloated legacy grand media outlets have become ossified, and they've become such protected spaces, and they're so partisan that it ceased to be a kind of normal media environment. It's like a kind of it's herds, it's tribes lining up and shooting at each other every day. So for example, I would love to see good old-fashioned left-wingers writing alongside proper right-wingers. And actually, we've got that on UnHerd in the UK. And weirdly, there's quite a lot of resonances between people on the right and on the left that never really get a chance to get explored. So I think if there's room, the room is for a heterodox, disruptive player that says, we are here looking for new alignments. We're not interested in the old kind of teams and the old ways of doing things. And we're not afraid of controversy either. And that's what we're hoping to do.
It's interesting. It really goes against the kind of wisdom or business model that you've seen a lot of publications in the US pursue over the last couple of years, right? So like if you take the Times, it seems like they've decided that they're far better off just focusing on a base of subscribers who are very fervently, partisan and progressive, and let's just sell them ads and subscriptions and everything else. Right. And to the point where, as you mentioned, you were referring to, I think, Barry Weiss's departure
Yeah.
times, but also, ultimately that all started with, their choice by James Bennett to publish an op-ed from a U.S. senator, and then that somehow led to the Times feeling like an unsafe space.
Yeah.
Led to a bunch of people in the editorial board losing their jobs. So in a world where everyone else is sort of following the Fox News business model lead and kind of going further and further into one direction, why do you have confidence that embracing the opposite, which is sort of putting people of all kinds of points of view next to each other, can work?
Well, because we've seen it work in the UK. Actually, 25% of our audience is American already, but we've seen this huge, tremendous growth, and we've outgrown a lot of the other new media and the legacy media guys here in the UK. And I think it's a cliche, but I think people are more intelligent than they let on, and more intelligent than they get treated like by these media outlets. We also publish in the open world of traffic, and I know the temptation to put a nice clickbaity headline on and feed the base with what they want to hear. And I can't say that we're totally immune to that feeling either. But the fact that we've done well just gives me hope that there's a big slice of people who are confused, intelligent, skeptical of the old shibboleths, the old kind of moral principles of either side, really feel like something new needs to come out of all of this chaos and are looking. And I'm sure they're in the US as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And look, there's clearly people who, it's funny, you have a world now where you have a view that questions the conventional wisdom, but it may not feel woke or acceptable by whatever tribe you self-identify with. And then as a result, you're thinking it, but it's very hard to express it or pursue it without all of a sudden heading into Twitter meltdown. But you guys, I think, especially around COVID, have kind of been doing that on Lockdown TV, which is, giving different points of view around the virus itself and the pandemic, especially with some interesting Swedish experts. How has it been so far? Why'd you do it, and how has it been?
It's been great. I think, we the YouTube channel we just started after lockdown happened. On lockdown day one, we started Lockdown TV. We were all stuck at home, so we thought, hey, well, let's do some interviews from here. And I guess everyone else was stuck at home as well, so there was plenty of time for people to watch them. But yes, it felt in those early, eerie weeks, just as it does still to some extent, that there was a whole spectrum of things that were not allowed to be said around the virus, around the pandemic, and around what a appropriate public health response should be. And at least in the UK, we had it reinforced by the BBC, which is this massive monolith in the middle of the media landscape, because they feel like they have this duty as the public service broadcaster to reinforce public health messaging. So anything that would question any of the measures that were announced by the government would have not made it onto the BBC, because they were like, keep calm, stay at home, obey the rules, pretty much on a kind of hourly basis. So there was this huge gap for people who just wanted to understand what was happening and ask all of the skeptical questions that I think many normal people had. My experience talking to American friends, and we got huge amounts of audience in the US as well, is that it was, if anything, even more taboo in the US. I'm half Swedish, half English, but I spent a lot of time in New York. So I have these kind of three countries that I kind of compare in my head, and the atmosphere, the heat and the tension and the politicization around this pandemic has definitely been most intense in the US. Obviously, it happened during a election year, and it very quickly became a kind of good versus evil, Democrat versus Republican sort of lens through which everything was seen. And it really shocked me, actually. I spoke to friends on the telephone who I really felt I had to be careful what I said with, because even in a private conversation, they were, strictly, obediently towing the line of what was officially responsible, and even kind of jokes around anything concerning the pandemic were just not allowed. So I've been quite frightened by what's happened this past year, and I think understandably, given the tensions and given the gravity of the situation, but definitely helped along by social media and helped along by the political environment, the kind of bounds of what is allowed to be said have shrunk. And yeah, the COVID issue was, if anything, was the worst of this, because there was this additional element of public health, what is responsible. And at that point, there's a very easy way to say, well, if you question this, you might be encouraging people not to obey the rules, therefore it's irresponsible, therefore you must not do it. So there's that additional kind of moral bludgeon. And yeah, I think it's been frightening. So I will be taking the vaccine, and I look forward to the end of this phase of this pandemic greatly. But I think that what we've seen happen this year, we shouldn't be kidding ourselves that it's suddenly going to disappear in the spring or in the summer. We've crossed some Rubicons, and that's going to stay for a while.
And the Rubicons, do you mean, because I've had this thesis that, forgetting about how this particular pandemic started, either way, if you're a nation state that's a bad actor or a really, really sophisticated terrorist organization, and you looked at COVID, you have to say the ROI is like tremendous, right? The amount of disruption to society is remarkable. Which seems to me that the obvious incentive then, if you're one of those people, is to try to create another pandemic, right? And just do it again. When we talk about crossing the Rubicon, is that you think that we're now in a world where we're going to be facing pandemics on a more regular basis, or do you think it's more around just that the health, but by the time we hit herd immunity, is going to take a lot longer than people think, or what do you mean?
I don't think you even need a terrorist group or a bad actor to synthesize a pandemic, although I agree that's theoretically possible. I think people have become so alive to this now, and we are so used to the level of available data about this particular virus that the next time there's any kind of pathogen that is new or worrying, and God knows they happen all the time, the same process will be kicked off, which is quick. We need to have huge amounts of information about it so that we can all start obsessing on a daily basis about charts of how this particular new strain, COVID-21, COVID-22, or whatever the hell it is, maybe it's could be bacteria, could be anything. We'll start seeing the charts coming back. And once the charts come back, we then have terrible projections about what could happen. And then, as we've seen this year, there's a sort of moral rush in the direction of taking more, not less action. And that means if you're a politician or you're a mayor or you're someone in charge of health policy, you don't want to be the guy who didn't do enough. And so let's rush ahead and start closing things down. Let's take preemptory steps. Let's close the schools. Let's start shutting down businesses or whatever it is. So I'm really worried that this sort of atmosphere will continue. And in terms of Rubicon, we have crossed the Rubicon of expecting central government to tell us in great detail what we can and can't do. Right down to, in the UK, we have whether we should use paper napkins or fabric napkins in a pub, and exactly what time it should shut, how many people we can see. That is new. That has not happened before. And if that is now associated with what a responsible government looks like, and has the endorsement of the kind of liberal, the high status liberals that still carry so much weight, I can't see how that's going to change. That is now what we understand the role of government to be since this year. And that, I think, is potentially really frightening. We could be facing years of having kind of free periods and periods where we're not so free, all under the theoretically virtuous goal of protecting us. So that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, it's funny how either side can use the goal or guise of protection of the public to justify a lot of behavior. So last question then, which is the ways that the world has evolved in the last few years that kind of created, I think, sort of the argument for a publication like UnHerd in the first place. Do you think that they continue as is even with Trump out of office, or do you think when he finally leaves, things calm down and some of the norms restore themselves?
I actually think next year could be a calmer year than people are expecting, which is good probably for the world and would be good for all of us personally. Is probably less good for media publications like ours because, the more anxious people are, the more media they consume. But I think, normal has become very desirable again. It's almost like a pendulum, isn't it? People got fed up with what seemed like a suffocating orthodoxy. And so we had this big wave of populist revolts in 2016. And we've lived in these kind of chaotic, turbulent times, ending with this pandemic that's been so abnormal. I think the majority of people would like as normal as possible a period now. Yeah. So I think it might be the kind of somewhat revenge of the normies, to use a internet term. We might get the old sort of technocrats who have been sitting on the sidelines and been feeling out of it. Now they're going to get another chance to be in charge, and maybe people will let them sit there for a little while, have some time out.
Yeah, I could use the break. So, Freddie, if someone wants to check out, subscribe to UnHerd, go to unherd.com. Where else can they find your work?
Yeah, UnHerd, unherd.com. And we're also on YouTube. You can search us on YouTube, search for Lockdown TV. We just published an interview earlier today.
There we go. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us. This was really one of the more interesting conversations we've ever had.
Thanks.